Good evening, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. Tonight, we're adumbrating the first half of Chapter 26, The Great West and the Agricultural Revolution, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. Abe, as usual, will you start us off?
Gladly. A frontier line began to develop, starting in central Texas and stretching all the way up to the Canadian border. West of this line, there were very few white people. Native Americans were also evolving at this time. Tribes drove other tribes to find new homes. For example, the Comanches drove the Apaches into the Rio Grande Valley. And when the white settlers were moving west, they began to cross through Indian territory, and they spread cholera and smallpox and further contributed to shrinking the bison population. This led to further hostility among the Indians. Now, the federal government dealt with the Indians by establishing the reservation system, marking out boundaries for each tribe's territory and thus creating a corridor of passage for Western settlers. The Indians only agreed to surrender their land once they had received promises from the U.S. government that 1, there would be peace, and 2, clothing and supplies would be provided. However, the flames of the Gilded Age still blazed bright, and as a result, many of the federal Indian agents were corrupt. Now, Frank, could you tell me what the effects were on the Indian population?
Well, the chief way that whites and Indians settled their territorial disputes was through violence. For example, in the Fetterman Massacre, a Sioux war party attacked and killed 81 American soldiers in Montana. The follow-up Battle of Little Bighorn proved to be one of the Indians' final victories, in which they annihilated Custer's entire force. The American reinforcements subsequently hunted down and destroyed the Indian warriors. Elsewhere, the Apaches gave resistance as well, but all tribes were eventually defeated by a factor of causes. First, increased transportation capacity due to the railroad. Second, diseases such as cholera were the ones you mentioned earlier. Third, the lack of reliable food source in the bison, which had been hunted to near extinction by the whites. And fourth and finally, the overall loss of land to American settlement. Abe, we've talked a bit about the bison that inhabited the Great Western Plains, but can you go into further detail on those?
Of course. Buffaloes, or bison, were the staff of life for Native Americans, and thankfully, there were around 15 million buffaloes living on the Western Plains after the Civil War. However, with the building of the railroad, buffaloes began to be slaughtered and fewer than 1,000 buffaloes were alive by 1885. This fact exhibited the waste and the greed of American society. Now, Frank, how are views towards the American Indians changing?
Well, by the late 1800s, sympathy was increasing for the Indians, and books such as A Century of Dishonor and Ramona increased awareness of their plight. Elsewhere, missionaries were surging into Indian land in an effort to convert them to Christianity. Unfortunately, U.S. troops were also moving into Indian territory, and at the Battle of the Wounded Knee, U.S. troops took out over 400 Indian civilians. The Dawes Act came along in 1887 and dissolved the tribe as a legal entity, replacing it with individual packet of land for every family. These families could become American citizens in a mere 25 years. Another consequence of the Dawes Act was a massive reduction in Indian land, from 156 million acres down to 78 million acres. Later, in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act restored the tribe, but the damage had been done. Abe, can you tell me what was one of the principal factors that drove Americans to move west?
Of course. In short, gold. 59ers rushed to Colorado when gold was discovered at Pikes Peak, and 59ers also poured into Nevada when gold was discovered at the Comstock Lode. And smaller lucky strikes caused many new mining towns, known as Hail Dorados, to sprout up. However, when gold became less plentiful, the towns turned into ghost towns. And the mining industry evolved to be run by large corporations instead of the bewhiskered individual miners. Some women also began to run boarding houses or began to work as prostitutes, and eventually several states such as Wyoming and Utah granted women the right to vote. All the gold and silver that was being dug up helped 1. to finance the Civil War, 2. to fund railroad construction, and 3. The gold and silver also escalated the conflict between Indians and whites. The silver issue was henceforth injected into American politics. Now, Frank, can you tell me how the beef industry evolved?
Of course, as cities grew, so did the demand for meat. And luckily, the railroad and refrigerator car made possible the transport of cattle and meat from the west to eastern cities. This led to the meatpacking industry in eastern cities like Chicago and Detroit. It also led to the rise of the cowboys, since men were needed to bring the cattle from their grazing zones in Texas to train depots in Dodge City and Wichita. However, as time wore on, this process became less and less practical, as barbed wire was used more and more by homesteaders in the West, thus leading to the eventual end of the cowboy. Abe, we've talked a bit about the factors which encouraged people to move to the West, be it the increased cattle production or the want for gold. But can you tell me what legislation actually eventually allowed people to move to the West efficiently?
Yes, the government passed the Homestead Act of 1862 and henceforth allowed a settler to obtain up to 160 acres of land by occupying the land for 5 years and paying a low fee. Essentially, all public land was being given away to encourage settlers to fill all the empty space. And although 160 acres may sound like a lot, it was actually inadequate since many families were forced to abandon their farms due to drought. John Wesley Powell, a geologist, warned that agriculture was impossible west of the 100th meridian since so little rain fell. Fraud was also rife with the Homestead Act. Corporations used dummy homesteaders to grab up the best properties. Another way of getting land was the railroads sold the land they had been given by the government to the settlers. But in the 1880s, disaster struck with the 6-year drought. The technique of dry farming emerged, which later proved damaging and caused the Dust Bowl. Farmers adapted, however, and tough strains of wheat imported from Russia ultimately proved successful. In the end, it was the federally funded irrigation projects that facilitated Western agriculture the most and hence caused Western settlement to boom. Now, Frank, could you tell me what the effects of the Homestead Act were?
Absolutely. As laws like the Homestead Act came into effect, there was a massive spike in populations moving to the West. New states began to be admitted to the Union like dominoes. Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, and Oklahoma were all added during this time period. Finally, by 1890, the census announced for the first time ever that America had no frontier and that the entire country had been settled. Abe, we've heard a lot about how this frontier is now dissolved because of the census, but what were the effects of that dissolution of the frontier?
All right, as you said, the frontier line vanished by 1890, inspiring the penning of Frederick Jackson Turner's essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. Overall, Americans were a mobile people, and the land itself, when sold, often was the settlers' most profitable crop. The frontier was even theorized as a safety valve, since when unemployment struck for the urban worker, he simply moved west and became a farmer. In actuality, few city dwellers moved to the frontier farms during Depression. The real safety valves were the new western cities, such as Chicago and Denver, since failed farmers moved there to seek fortunes. The West, overall, was very unique. In the West, Anglo culture conflicted most directly with Hispanic culture, and in no other region did the U.S. government ever play such a large role in social and economic development. Now, Frank, how were farms evolving at this time?
Well, just like what happened on southern plantations, farmers in the West increasingly turned to cash crops. This had the odd effect of turning farmers into producers and consumers, since now even farmers had to buy food, seeing as they would only grow a few certain types of crop. This also led to the onset of factory farming, in which wealthy farmers worked hundreds of acres by using new steam-powered combine harvesters. This change in farming methods is known as the mechanization of agriculture. And this was especially prominent in California, where reformer Henry George accused the state of selling out to plantations.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.
Comment down below if you have any questions.
We'll catch you guys next time.